Welcome to B&W Insights. I'm your host, Mark Siefert, and on today's episode, we have a little switcheroo. I'll be jumping over to the other side of the table, and we'll be talking rate studies. Carolyn Greaves will be the host today, and we'll talk about equitable rates, affordability, and how to have these difficult conversations. Ready? Let's get started.
Well, hello, Mark. How are you today?
It's good. A little different on this side of the table, but I like it.
How does it feel?
It's interesting. I like it.
Well, you've been doing an awesome job on these podcasts over the past several months, and we thought it'd be a great time to actually put you in the hot seat and have you talk a little bit about some of the things that I know you do very well for Baxter and Woodman.
I'm excited. Let's get started.
But let's back up just a little bit. I've known you for many years, and you've always been a public works director that I've worked with in Crest Hill and any other communities?
No, just Crest Hill.
How did you get into being a public works director? How do you even join the municipal industry?
It's a fun story. I was actually in college going to become a history teacher, and I started working at the city of Crest Hill as summer help, and I fell in love with being outside. I realized I could not be in an office or a classroom 9 months out of the year, and every day in public works is different.
Yeah.
As we look at public works, you're could be doing something in the morning, something totally different in the afternoon, and that really appealed to me. And working my way up through wastewater operator, water operator, director of water, wastewater, and then finally as a public works director, it really gave me an appreciation for everything that public works had to offer, whether it was the guy cutting the grass, the snow plowing, main breaks, whatever it is.
That's amazing. And so now how long have you been with B&W now?
It'll officially be about 18 months.
Now, one thing I know that you have told me that you love to do are water and sewer rate studies.
I do. It's I fell in love with them. It's been, I did one when I was public works director, and it was very intriguing to me. The finance, the socioeconomic portion of it, the political realm of it, it really brings all of my interests together. And starting here at Baxter and Woodman, I was able to do more of them, grow into the role of leading them, and now managing them across our entire platform.
So let's back up just a little bit. And can you explain what is a water and sewer rate study?
So water and sewer funds is an enterprise fund. And municipalities should run their water and sewer funds like a business. It's there to be self-sustaining. It's there to make sure that, you can fund everything in the water and sewer department through those rates. You don't want to be pulling money from your tax base, and you don't want to be pulling money from other places to supplement it. It's to fully fund your water and sewer.
So who usually does rate studies?
It's anybody who is a water supplier, whether you purchase from an agency, if you are buying and then reselling, if you produce your own water, if you're a sanitary district. It's really anyone who provides water and sewer service to their residents.
Now, because I have a little behind the scenes, I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. You have to gather up a lot of data to be able to do a rate study. Tell me a little bit about that process and how you really would get one started with a community.
Yeah, and that's the fun part of it, when we get to dive into the data. Every community is different. Every community has a different level of data and a different amount. And what we really do is we start with the basics. We take the last 5 years of a community's ACFRs.
Explain that.
The Annual Comprehensive Financial Report.
Thank you.
Which is the audited financial statements for a community. We're looking at their water billed, their water produced, see if we have water loss. We're looking at their budgets. We're looking to see a breakdown of where they're spending their money and where their revenues are coming from. And that's the heart of it, is we look at the last 5 years to predict the next 8. We do rate studies in the 8 years, in 8-year increments. 8 years that people often ask, why are we doing 8 years? As we look at the last 5 years, there was, huge changes in the industry, from pricing to things happening, and we went through a pandemic. 5 years are the length of a capital plan most times. So to get through that capital plan of 5 years, we want to put some on the back end as well to make sure you're building up for that next capital plan. 10 years is getting too far out. if we're in 2024 right now, think about in 2014, 10-year budget plans or 10-year capital plans, the amount of things that have changed. We never thought that there would be a pandemic. We never thought pricing would be doing what it's doing. So to do a 10-year plan is really looking pretty far into the future. I use an analogy that, being a weather nerd as well, I use the cone of uncertainty for hurricanes. When they're predicting a hurricane, they're really good in the next 24, 48, 36 hours. But the further you go out, that uncertainty really sets in.
Sure.
Same thing with rate studies. The further we go out, we don't know what's going to happen in 4, 6, 10, 12, 13 years, but we're good for those first 5.
And we know infrastructure is aging. It doesn't last forever. It's just like if you owned your own home, your roof doesn't last forever. You have to put money into it to keep working for you. What usually initiates a community needing to start a rate study?
So that's a twofold question, I'd say. It should be about every 3 to 5 years that they should do one. Many communities don't do that. So if you're on rotation every 5 years, that's great. Keep that going, keep your rates updated. Most of the time, it's when a community says, we have so many projects. How are we going to fund this? Our capital infrastructure plan, because our infrastructure is aging, is X millions of dollars, Y millions of dollars. We need to fund this. How are we going to do it? So sometimes it's how do we fund a specific project? How do we fund a specific plan? But really, it should be looked at every year. We tell communities to look at your rates every year, update them. It's easier to make small changes than wholesale changes. If you have to do a percent up or down, that's a lot more palatable to residents rather than a 10% increase.
So that's a really good point on having small increases are a lot easier to add into a budget. Two of the words that I keep hearing are equity and affordability. I think those are hot topics with regards to rate studies these days. How do you approach both of those topics?
I think affordability is one where we look at your neighboring communities. We want to make sure that the rates that you're paying on an average bill, and then we look at your MHI, your median household income, and make sure that bill isn't starting to creep up there above some of the standards we have. But then also we look at equity, and is the people who are using the water and the people who need the infrastructure paying for it. If it's a large business and they have to have a large water main supplying them, are they paying their fair share? So that's equity, making sure that everybody's paying their fair share in terms of user class. When I say user class, it's residential, commercial, industrial, making sure that those groups are paying what they should.
So let's dive into that a little bit more if we can, Mark. So you mentioned there's different user classes for rates. How do you do that? Balance what the needs are between a residential rate and a commercial or industry rate?
And that's where we start looking at the cost of service. In the cost of service model, we're able to look at all the infrastructure, all the expenses, and this goes back to having good data, the good expenses, or knowing the expensive, knowing the data, and saying, for this area of residential, what infrastructure is needed in order to supply them water?
Right.
For the commercial, what infrastructure is needed? And we put a dollar amount to that. And we say, if the dollar amount for the commercial is this much, there's this many commercial, this is the expenses, what's that rate needed in order to cover their expenses? So we actually will look and see as a cost of service model what it is. On the flip side, there's also a rate study compared to a cost of service. In a rate study, we're really just looking at what the rates are that they currently have, the class systems they currently have, because a lot of these classes have been there for many, many years. They're a legacy. And to change a class system or to change how people are being billed, that's where we get into the political aspect of it. And it seems like every 6 months there's an election now, and most of them are contested. And we want to, we're fighting those election cycles to say, can we make wholesale changes?
So you mentioned again a little bit, there's different potential classes of rates for commercial and residential. Have you seen any creative approaches that communities have used to help minimize the impact on their residents?
Yeah, and that's a policy decision. If you're looking to be equitable, that's you do a class system. Some want equality, where everyone pays the same rate. That really gets into a policy decision by your elected officials. It also breaks down to how many of those are in each group. If there's one industrial, one commercial, and the rest residential, well, residential is going to be paying the lion's share because they're 98% of the usage. So really, it's case by case, but there's not ever one way to build a rate. We can look at inclining block, declining block, tier structures, base plus volumetric, fixed meter scale. There's a bunch of different ways.
So a lot of techie terms you threw out there.
Yes.
Is there a typical rate structure that we see used?
The great thing is no.
Okay.
I know that's not the greatest answer, but every community, as they've evolved throughout the decades, has kind of built their own independent way of billing. We see general similarities, but you'll always see like this specific thing with a specific community. And that's what makes these rate studies enjoyable for me and my team, is that we make sure that we're looking at your community as your community. We're not trying to push someone else's ideas on you. We want you to fit your standard, what your residents are used to, but also giving you new ideas to move towards in the future.
So it's very unique to what
Absolutely.
each community's needs are.
Absolutely. It's really building a solution to fit your community's needs.
So let's talk about the community needs just a little bit. You've mentioned a couple times that the rates need to cover the costs for operation, the costs for improvements. How much do we get into helping to develop some of those costs?
Well, the operations costs they've been growing throughout the years. We look at it as your operations costs they're going to continue to grow, and unless you know something coming, we'll just escalate those at a percentage that we agree on. But really, that capital improvement plan is where we can start having some fluctuations. We play a little Tetris. We're trying to fit all the blocks where we can find the money, because we want to make sure that you don't have a huge rate increase, a lower increase, and then bounce it around. We want to make sure it's something that residents can handle. But then each community does have needs of this project has to go in this year, this has to go in this year. We have a regulation from the IEPA, US EPA has this. We have this new development coming in. So it's completely customized to make sure that we meet the needs of the capital and operational needs of the community in this year and going forward.
So let's talk a little bit about the conversation of rates. And, as, again, a homeowner, no one likes to have more bills coming at them. How do you help educate a board, a council, the residents? How do you help them understand why we're having this conversation about rates and what that will do for the community?
I think it's twofold. Number one is the education of why we do rate studies, why we have to increase rates, why we have to do infrastructure improvements. If infrastructure improvements aren't taking place, the costs are actually going to go up higher. The more a main breaks, then operations costs go up. If we have to put a new treatment plan in, other costs are going to go up. So it's education on why we're doing this, but also education on water rates are some of the cheapest rates around. If you look at your gas, your electric, your utilities in terms of cell phone or
All
cable,
the streaming services.
everything. If you put that all together or look at all of those holistically, water rates are some of the most palatable and the ones that are the most equitable. You look at some communities who are at $4, $5, $6, $7 per 1,000 gallons. Let's just use the example of $5 for 1,000 gallons of water. If you go to the store right now and try to buy a gallon of water, $1 or $2. So that's 2 gallons at the store compared to 1,000 out of your tap.
That's a really good perspective to take away from this conversation today. I'm curious a little bit about what other challenges you're seeing municipalities face with addressing rates right now. We talked about regulations. We talked about aging infrastructures. What are you seeing? Are there any trends that are happening right now?
The biggest problem or the biggest challenge that we're seeing is that, during the building boom, communities didn't really have to raise rates because they had such an increase in customers coming in. So that increased revenue and that increased tap-on fees and all those things were happening. So they didn't have to raise rates, and now we're seeing big increases having to happen. With the combination of the prices increasing after COVID and rates not being increased for many years, we're now having to see larger increases. So having to make those larger increases palatable, whether we're spreading them out in what we call a ramp up phase, where you go 1, 3, 5, something like that, to actually slowly increase it, or some communities like to just take a big bite and chunk right off at the beginning. So really, that's the biggest issue we're seeing, is that these increases are having to be a little higher than they normally would because of all the factors that are going on.
So what's the flip side, Mark? If you don't address your needs and increase rates, what happens?
If you don't raise rates and you can't pay for any of this stuff, infrastructure improvements aren't going to happen. Really, the big part is a lot of these water mains that we're put in the ground in the 40s, 50s, 20s. That's 100 years ago.
Yeah.
I had a community say, well, we just put new mains in 1960, 1970. And the response was, that was over 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And people don't think of 1970 as 50 years ago. I feel like there's a socioeconomic part of our brain that really says 1970, that's only 30 years ago. We're all kind of stuck. We think we're in the 2000s.
Right.
So everybody's stuck thinking, 1970 is 30 years ago. That's still got 20 more years. Well, no, we're in 2024. Those mains are 50, 60 years old now. So as that increase, as that lifespan decreases, we're looking at more breaks, more inconveniences, higher prices.
And there's definitely an out of sight, out of mind also that has to be talked about here.
Absolutely. And, I had, somebody once told me, if a resident turns on their faucet in the morning and water comes out and they can flush their toilet, they're happy. They don't care about how it gets there, what went into it, and any of the other things that happen. So we need to make sure that continues to happen.
Right.
They open their faucet, they flush their toilet, but what we need to do is start educating them on how that happened. And that is a industry-wide thing that needs to happen, is education. People are getting educated on so many things these days. There's information overload. So it's really finding that way to educate the public.
So I want to go back again to our start of our conversation. Coming from a public works director background, how do you think that's helped you do rate studies for other communities?
I feel like the first thing is I've sat in their seat. I've done a rate study. I've had to present that to a council and say, we need to raise our rates X amount. So I'm in there. I've done that with them in their shoes. The other thing is I feel like it's a good, a public works director, we're putting out fires every day. So being able to multitask and say, all right, while looking at the capital improvements, but also looking here at the equitability and affordability, how do we bring that together? And understanding all of the projects that are going on and the needs of the projects and the importance of the projects really helps our clients out.
So I think you've touched on this topic a couple times here, but I'm going to ask you, for our listeners, if you had one piece of advice, if a community is thinking about starting a rate study, a public works director seeing needs increase in their community, what are the first things they should do? What's their takeaway from today?
I think there's two things they really need to start doing. Is number one, education. Start talking to your board. Start informing them of the capital needs. The worst thing a public works director could do is say, we need to raise our rates 15% because of these projects. And the board says, what projects? So start educating them on the needs of the infrastructure. Let them know we need all of these things done. And because of that, we're going to need a rate study.
Build the case.
Yep. The second one is start collecting data. The more data you have, the better the rate study goes. Whether it's billing and pumping and customer classes, all that information, have it in a succinct place where you can find it.
Mark, any final words as the guest instead of the host today?
No, this went by a lot faster than I thought from being on this side of the table. But no, for all of our clients, think about all these things. And we know in the next 5 years, there's more and more infrastructure needs and, making sure that you start planning appropriately.
Well, thank you for letting me ask you questions today. I'm going to let you close us out and let you take your seat back.
I'll jump to that side of the table.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. Thanks, Carolyn, for hosting this episode of the podcast. As I said in the interview, rate studies are very important as capital infrastructure continues to age. For our entire team here at Baxter Woodman, check what's on the menu next.